Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Marin Economic Briefing. My name is Mike Blakely, and I'm the CEO of the Marin Economic Forum. For those that don't know, we're a 501c3 public benefit organization providing research and advisory on the Marin County and regional Bay Area economy. You can find out more about our activities and sign up for our newsletter by visiting our website at marineconomicforum.org. And you can also find out about our new partner program, which is designed to let you, the community, have more engagement with MEF's day-to-day work. So welcome to the final Marin Economic Briefing of the year for December. And it is that time where economists and banks and anybody else who has a stake in the economy is starting to make their projections for what will happen next year in 2024. What we are seeing, and our chief economist, Rob Eiler, will talk a lot more about this, but what we're seeing is a lot of disagreement, actually, between different groups. In fact, there was an article in The Economist magazine this week, talking about how 4 of the largest investment banks have projections for economic growth next year that are span anywhere from 1% to 2.5%. And when you're looking at very strong economic growth being anywhere between 2 and 3%, that range of disagreement between those investment banks is really interesting. It just underscores that nobody really knows and everybody has their opinion. This morning, the Consumer Price Index came out. It showed that prices rose about 3.2%. So that means the Fed's job of getting us down to that 2% is starting to work. It's moving down again this month. And that number is a much more respectable number than where we were at last year in terms of the Consumer Price Index. So we're going to get into all of that today. We're going to talk about the macro U.S. situation. We're going to look a little more at the state and Marin County, of course. Rob's going to give a view into what he's seeing for 2024, and then I'm going to do the same, drilling down to the Marin County level at the end of our program. So once again, thank you for joining us this morning. We are recording this, and we'll be sending this recording and the slide deck out later. And I'm going to now welcome in our chief economist, Rob Eiler. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks so much. And thanks, folks, for making the time today to come and hear what we have to say and engage with us. So what I want to start with is the labor market. The labor market and its continued strength is the main reason why we have not had a declared recession yet in the United States since the original shock of the pandemic. But I want to compare it to the Great Recession. So the Great Recession lasted, from a labor market standpoint, from November 2007 until about 78 months later. So it lingered all the way into 2014. And part of the issue in terms of what's happened since the pandemic is we have had that original shock. So if I start the number of people that were working in the United States in January 2020 and make that number equal to 100, it's the same sort of evolution as saying that the total number of people working in November 2007 was equal to 100. And now you can compare the 2 recessions in terms of the labor market, recession, recovery, and expansion. So when the number goes above that red dotted line, the labor market's actually expanding from its pre-recession peak. And we're about 3.3% above the January 2020 seasonally adjusted number of people working in the United States. So while that black line is increasing, it's increasing at a decreasing rate, which means it's starting to get a little flatter, which, to Mike's point about prices, the Federal Reserve also wants to see the job growth in the United States fade a little bit. And for the most part, that's also started to show its face. And the game that's being played in forecasters' minds, and I'll talk about this in just a few minutes, is whether or not we will see a strong labor market fade, which would, in a sense, speed up the inflation drop toward the longer-term inflation expectations number, which we're going to talk about in just a second. And that transition between a hotter job market and higher inflation to a flatter job market and lower inflation is really what the Federal Reserve has been trying to craft with higher interest rates. The game is how much of that downturn, if it exists, will ultimately move the entire economy closer to recession. But for right now, the labor market still remains relatively warm, and without some coldness coming in to the labor market, we will not have a declared recession in the United States anytime soon. Now, to Mike's point, we have seen prices dropping. The CPI data came out and suggested that we are still kind of on the track to get back down to what you could think of as the level that the Federal Reserve would like to see But the consumer price index is not necessarily the price index that the Federal Reserve is watching. They actually, when they're thinking about policy, they're watching this one. This is actually a slide that's pulled right out of their deck when they're making decisions, like they're going to talk about here in just a little while when they meet this month. The core personal consumption expenditures price index, or what we think of as core PCE prices, is this evolution since January 2007. You can see from most of that span of time to October 2023, which are the latest data here on this slide, the price, that inflation rate, the percentage change from 12 months previous, basically lingered around that blue dotted line or below it for most of the entire time between 2007 and 2021. And then it shot up like a rocket. It lingered at that high level for about 7 or 8 months. And then when the Federal Reserve got aggressive on interest rates, it started to fade down. And that fade really kicked in over the last 12 or 15 months. But that number at 3.5% for October means that compared to October 2022, the prices of what you buy at home, except for food and energy products and services, which is why we call this one core, we pull out food and energy prices, we've only seen that go up by 3.5%. Now, with that in mind, the change in that basket of goods we buy at home only going up by 3.5%, that is still relatively high inflation. But what the Federal Reserve is trying to do is shape that blue solid line through those red dots, which at least for this year, it's gone a little faster than they expected. Those red dots were the forecast of the Federal Reserve that was put together about 2 months ago. They're actually seeing it fade a little faster for this year and then moving toward the blue dotted line, which is what we think of as the long-term inflation expectations that the Federal Reserve is trying to shape in terms of how financial markets and labor markets think about inflation and ultimately how we think about it at home. So what we're watching closely is that, are we going to see jobs growth continue? So the combination of the last slide and this slide is really the key way of thinking about what the Federal Reserve is considering when they're thinking about increasing or decreasing interest rates. And with the prices moving down, including the CPI, which is the sister price index, as we just talked about, to the core PCE prices, we probably will not see another interest rate increase before this cycle ends. Which, if you're thinking about financial markets, that's probably a good thing. The next big question is when we actually will start to see a fade. And most financial market forecasters are thinking we're going to see a fade of interest rates starting probably the second or third quarter of 2024 in earnest. But we might see one cut in March. But it's so much of that depends on what happens in labor markets to actually give the Federal Reserve the feeling that their job has ended in terms of increasing interest rates and lowering inflation. And thus they can start taking some of the pressure off of labor markets. And when you hear about a soft landing in the news, when you hear in the financial news that we might be able to have a so-called soft landing, a lot of that is really avoiding recession and really avoiding a lot of unemployment while taming inflation. If we can weave through that turbulence, that's really the idea of a soft landing. So we should not expect, however, for the Fed to cut interest rates until we actually start to see those job increases fade and or we start to see job losses, and that we continue to see the fall specifically in this price index. So the combination of those data are leading forecasters to thinking about, okay, what's the next few years look like? If the Federal Reserve is going to start fading rates in 2024, that will reshape the so-called yield curve, or what basically lenders get for the next dollar they lend in terms of profitability. If we look at what forecasters thought about maybe 6 weeks ago, every quarter the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Branch interviews 40 forecasters, and they give a bunch of different data to that interview process. And I pull out 3 pieces of data from that process. One is the growth of real GDP, or thinking about inflation adjusted incomes and how that's growing from the previous year. And the latest forecast actually upgraded 2023. The third quarter of 2023 really surprised forecasters by being much better than expectations almost across the board. The Atlanta Fed was really the only forecasting body that suggested we would have very, very robust third quarter growth. And that boosted up the fourth quarter look forward in terms of the end of this year and also for next year. So one of the weird things about forecasting, and Mike had suggested this right off the top, is that we've had this sort of rolling window of pain in forecasting where we think recession or some slower part of the economy is coming over the next 12 months, and then something good happens and we move that forecast another quarter forward. And it's just sort of this rolling window of when we're finally going to feel the pain of relatively high interest rates and the lingering effects of relatively high inflation. You can see in 2025, there's a little bit of a fade from the previous quarter's forecast, and the shaded column of these numbers is the November 2023 forecast, and the column just next door that's labeled previous is the previous quarter's forecast. So you can see there was a downgrade for 2025 and then an upswing for 2026. So if you think about the pain coming later in 2024 and then lingering into 2025, that's the current forecast window for a slower moving economy, but not necessarily a recessionary one. There are a couple of forecasters out there that believe we will go into a very mild recession, either Q2 or Q3 next year. It will only last a couple of quarters. But folks, it's absolutely important to recognize that the declaration of recession is not as important in the medium term. It will be important to financial markets when in fact it gets declared at some point in the future, which may not be in this cycle, but will be at some point in the future. But it's really about how much of the lingering problems that created the downward pressure in the economy remain into the medium term. So labor markets, for example, do not look like they're going to lift off from their current low unemployment rates and really kind of the warmness anytime soon. Most economies would trample each other to try to get to 4.2% unemployment. So that's really good, a really good outlook in terms of where labor markets are going over the next few years. And even though we're seeing a little bit of lift, you can see it, that's basically gone up across the board. It's not going up by very much. And a lot of that's really labor force changes that we're actually seeing more people come back in the labor force, and that sort of lingering pool of people might pick up unemployment just barely, but just barely. And the core PCE inflation is the exact red dots we saw in the last slide. And so all these data point to a relatively optimistic outlook for the next couple of years. And the resiliency in the American economy, even in the midst of so-called relatively high interest rates, it has been very intriguing for economists across the board, because we really expected a little bit more of a sharp contraction. And that's why I said we've had this rolling window of pain rather than in fact sort of saying, okay, we know it's coming. There's been a lot of confusion in the markets, especially with all the geopolitical issues. And so when we think about things to watch next year, I want to give kind of a regional transition in thinking more broadly. We should start to see more commercial real estate concerns, specifically in the core Bay Area, and thinking about San Francisco. So I would be watching the news very closely for having certain buildings going back to lenders, having more pressure on occupancy rates, what that means in secondary and tertiary markets around the major office spaces in San Francisco, and in the slow devolution of other businesses in San Francisco while a medium-term to long-term adjustment takes place. That could start to ripple up into Marin County a little bit. We are going to have elections next year, and how much the uncertainty around specifically the presidential election might keep businesses from making expansion decisions in the midst of relatively high interest rates, all that lingering around. That's another reason why we're seeing a little bit of a slower growth forecast for next year. We are going to continue to talk about housing in the city and county chambers. It's not changing. All that stuff is going to continue. For Marin County, construction's been pretty strong over the last year, but we're going to watch very closely as we creep closer toward the end of this decade how much more concern exists over housing, specifically in places like Marin County, but thinking more North Bay. And we do expect interest rates to fall. So watch for the Federal Reserve making those decisions, and also how long-term rates are adjusting to the relatively high inflation rates that are still lingering around. Even though they're not that high from where we were about a year ago, they still are higher than we'd seen, as you saw in that graph with the core PCE prices, than we'd seen for 15 or 16 years. And investors are making adjustments about how inflation expectations are going to start to affect their longer-term outlook on yields on assets. So the Federal Reserve is thinking about that when they think about shaping forecast or shaping the interest rates going forward. Watch for all those changes, primarily in the second and third quarter next year. Now, I want to move toward the state and regional markets in terms of labor, and then thinking about some other things with specifically to Marin County, and then I'll hand it back over to Mike. If we look at the labor force in California, these are people that live in California and either actively seeking work, meaning they're looking for a job, or they're working for some employer regardless of where they're employed. We have still not gotten back to the pre-pandemic peak of the number of people in California that are part of the labor force. Now, part of that's because we've had outbound migration and people have left California. We've also had people that have left the labor force because they've retired. But the bottom line is we have fewer people around looking for work. And the number of people who are employed from that blue line is also not, or has not gotten back to its original peak before the pandemic. So the big thing about this number here is you'll notice on the far right-hand side, that orange line has been relatively flat. And in fact, as of October 2023, the 14 months previous has basically been zero growth of employed Californians. Almost exactly what the Federal Reserve is trying to do at the national level and has not quite achieved yet in the labor market. California is having this sort of balancing act between inbound or people that are released from work and people that are gaining access to work, where the net change for Californians is basically zero over the last 14 months. So watch for that starting to fade. You can see a little bit of a curl down, but that's really just because it's sort of lingering around the 15-month outcome that really has not changed that much. The big number is this, and so watch what happens now. The black line is the number of people who are working for a California-based employer, regardless of where they live. So that number historically, if you go to the left, these data start January 2010 on a monthly seasonally adjusted basis. If I took you back all the way to the beginning of the labor market data, which is in essence 1976, the distance between the number of people who live in California and have a job, the orange line, and the black line, those that work for a California-based employer, has always had a gap, because Californians are working all around the world and work for global employers. But that is now flipped because of migration, because Californian employers are hiring from outside the state. And we've seen a twist where basically that gap is closed. So that's an intriguing thing in terms of where people are working, how they're working, and the way in which California employers are actually looking for workers, even though we know there's been decades of using, let's say, outsourced labor. It's now really come to a head in terms of the aggregate. If we look at Marin County, we're going to see a very similar picture. We have not gotten back to the pre-pandemic peak in terms of labor force, nor in the number employed, nor in the number of people that have been hired by Marin County-based employers. So again, the blue and the orange are people that live in Marin County. The black are people that work for a Marin County-based employer. However, we're not that far away from the pre-pandemic peak in terms of the number of people working for a Marin County-based employer. So we've seen Marin County's economy continue to generate jobs, continue to pick up. The gross regional product data for 2022 after inflation came out last week for all the counties in California and all the counties and townships around the United States. And Marin County actually has seen consistent growth since before the pandemic in gross regional product, which is different than a lot of other counties around California. So the economic core of Marin County continues to provide inflation-adjusted gains for local employers, and they're hiring against those gains. Now, if we look at the industry changes in Marin County, I want to show you, and I have jobs in leisure and hospitality as the title here because I want to focus on that in just a second. If you look at the industrial composition of change in jobs in Marin County, every industry lost jobs in April and May 2020. And this is really another way of thinking about the pandemic shock. But look at what happens. By the end of December 2022, or thinking at the end of last year, we'd seen a few industries recover and actually start to expand. And by the October data, we've actually seen a few continue to expand, but we also have a lot of them who have not quite come back to that pre-pandemic peak. That's why you're seeing the black line in the last graph not quite come back yet. But if you look at the far right-hand side, jobs in leisure and hospitality have actually picked up. And if you compare to California, and this is why that's there, it's a note to myself to remember I say this, is that if you look at California, California's leisure and hospitality has also picked up, but Marin County's really seen a lot more action there. And part of that's because when people traveled coming out of the pandemic, they traveled more regionally. In terms of the core Bay Area, Marin County became a place where people wanted to get outdoors, and that started to provide returns for the sort of cluster of travel and tourism-based services in Marin County. And that hiring is now above and beyond. As you can see, construction's only had 9.5% growth since before the pandemic. All these are based on January 2020 numbers as the benchmark. That coming back of leisure and hospitality really tells you that about a decade's worth of economic development activity is starting to show dividends, which has been great. To show you another angle on leisure and hospitality, this is occupancy rates in Marin County looking from before the pandemic, April 2019 forward. You can see the sharp cut at the beginning of the graph moving left to right. You can see sort of the figuring out what's going to happen next coming into 2021 and 2022. But then we've seen that pickup, and it's been relatively consistent ever since 2021. So that on its own is not really as important as the next part. This is Napa's occupancy rates in terms of their hotel assets. And you can see Marin County, for the most part, has consistently beat Napa in terms of the occupancy rates in hotels, which suggests that Marin County has become slightly more competitive regionally in terms of the hotel assets and the economic development around driving visitors toward Marin County. Napa was going to get those people back, and they have, and they've come back strong over the last couple of years. But it's nice to see Marin County getting a little bit more action in terms of those occupancy rates against Napa. This is Sonoma County, which basically follows Napa very closely. People visit Napa and Sonoma County primarily for the same reasons. In San Francisco, the green line, I'm going to remove that and then bring it back. Notice that green line really got moved down in early 2020, which makes a lot of sense, but has slowly lingered back up toward now basically a regional norm, which is somewhere around 70% in terms of an average for the year in the hot part of the tourism time. So Marin County is really showcasing itself as a place where people visit, and you're seeing that in both occupancy rates, the return to hoteliers, and also in hiring. One piece of data that did come out here lately about Marin County, I wanted to highlight this briefly, is work from home. So I've had a lot of questions about how people have worked from home or not worked from home. Marin County has seen this change, at least according to the census data, on a 5-year rolling window average in terms of thinking from 2017 to 2022, what's the average number of workers that are working from home that live in Marin County? And it's just under 26% of folks that live in Marin County and have a job are working from home. Now, that's inclusive of self-employed people, but that is the second highest in the state of California. Trinity County is the only county in California that has a higher percentage of its working residents working from home. And California is just about a little over half that amount on a consistent basis. So Marin County is a place where a lot of people work from home. And what that can be is it can, at least in essence, be a sign that there's a really nice entrepreneurial cell of people that live in Marin County and are working from home because they have the ability to do that. And it's generating a lot of new businesses out of just people who live in Marin County, and they're able to bring those returns and keep them in the county. So if you hear when I told you earlier about gross regional product, part of that's because these new businesses are springing up throughout Marin County and providing dividends for the entire county economy. This is a housing forecast. Again, looking forward, housing is probably going to have somewhat of a turbulent year. Part of that's going to be that the lingering high interest rates, while not every housing transaction is interest rate based, we should expect some fade in housing markets. But a warning is that I've seen the housing forecast go all over the place this year. Again, as Mike suggested right off the top, some of the confusion in the economic forecast is coming into housing markets. Very tough to know where things are going. Short of the idea, we do not expect an enormous number of existing units to go up, but the existing units are starting to slowly roll onto market, as are new units that have been built based on permitting processes and the idea that we want to build more housing units as we creep toward 2031 in a lot of housing elements, and the so-called regional housing need allocations needing to be satisfied by a lot of municipalities. So we should expect throughout California more units to go on versus demanded over the next year. But how large or small that change will be has gone all over the place in forecasters that are watching this on a regular basis. You can see Marin County is down about 4.1%. That's after a 3-year run, about 25% growth at the median. I want to leave you with a look at population change. These data came out over summer and were refined about a month and a half ago by the Department of Finance. These are data that go into the planning processes in the state government around what are we going to need in terms of transportation, what are we going to need in terms of school financing, and where we expect that to happen throughout the state. California, over the next 40 years, is going to continue to see really no growth in population until maybe the end of this decade. Then it's going to grow very slowly, peak in the 2040s, and then fade right back to the 2020 level of population according to your state demographers. So this is a picture of California that people are going to be drawn back. Then we're going to have another generation go through. We're going to have fewer babies, and we're going to be right back where we started 40 years after the pandemic. Marin County, the fade will continue and will kind of flatten out over the next 7 or 8 years, and then kind of go into a long-term norm where by 2060 we'll be about 7.5%, 8% down from where we were before the pandemic. A lot of this is an aging society, not a lot of additional housing units, and a little higher cost of living. And for the Bay Area 9 counties, there is an expectation we will see continued growth throughout the next 40 years, but increasing at a decreasing rate over most of that stretch of time. So this picture suggests that we're having lingering labor market issues. We're aging as a state and really aging in the North Bay, where Marin County is kind of the flag bearer of an aging society. But watch for these changes in terms of the next few years and how the economic forecast for this region kind of affects the way people look at living here, working here, or just coming here with wealth. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Mike. The next year or so looks better than it did a quarter ago, but there are some clouds on the horizon. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Let me ask just a couple of follow-up questions before we move on, and we're coming up on time here. But the first one has to deal with the Marin County employment picture. In your graph, it looked as if the rate of employees from outside Marin but holding a job in Marin was increasing at a faster rate, suggesting that employers here are hiring people from out of Marin at a faster rate. Did I understand that correctly? And does that make sense?
You do, and it does.
Okay.
The local employers are pulling from the regional labor market, and that's because the local labor market in Marin County is faded in terms of the number of people.
Right. And then the second one is when you look at the jobs and the recovery of jobs in different sectors, one of the sectors that's very important to Marin but has not had that same recovery is in the retail sector. But the interesting thing is that for the last 2 years, sales tax revenues collected by Marin County jurisdictions have been sort of record highs. So what that suggests to us is that consumption is still occurring at a high rate. It's just that consumption has shifted perhaps more to online sales as it was increasing during the pandemic at any rate. So that suggests to us that those jobs could be down because retailers, especially small ones, are having a hard time finding workers and filling jobs. But in addition to that, the retail sector here, the brick and mortar traditional retail sector that powers a lot of the downtowns across Marin, is still maybe not recovering as well as leisure and hospitality, for example, which also saw significant cuts but then dropped. So just two main points on the information that you presented, Rob. And Now maybe you could jump real quick to my slide. And with the time we have left, I'm going to talk about some of the things we're watching. We've got an election coming up next year. 3 supervisors are going to be running for election. 2 of them, Supervisor Dennis Rodoni and Supervisor Stephanie Moulton Peters, will be running for re-election. Supervisor Katie Rice will not be running for re-election. But nonetheless, there is the chance that the composition and the faces on our board of supervisors could be changing next year. And then, of course, there are local jurisdictional races. One of the things we're really looking at here is couple of local and regional bond measures. So locally, you may have seen that the TAM High School District is going to be putting a bond on the ballot. The value of the bond on the ballot is $517 million, but if you look at the entire cost of that bond, it's over the 30-year period, it's over $1 billion, making it one of the largest ever potentially bonds in Marin County. That's coming up. But also in the Bay Area region-wide, there are 2 important ones. Well, one is an affordable housing bond that right now is estimated to be between $10 and $20 billion for the region. That would have several $100 million potentially coming to Marin County to contribute to the affordable housing issue. And then, of course, there's also a transportation bond, maybe not in 2024, but there's discussion of that. One of the main things that could lead to the placement of that transportation bond in coming years is a state legislature act that would change the voting approval in the state of California on major bond issues and other legislative issues from a 2/3 majority to 55% majority. So if that happens, there's a high likelihood that a transportation bond would be placed in the and I don't believe it's next year, but in the coming years. Rob talked about the housing elements in RENA. We still have a few jurisdictions in Marin that have not yet had those housing elements approved. And then finally, we are hearing that it's going to be pretty good next year. But what's really been the story of 2023 has been consumer activity that has really defied logic that most of us were looking at earlier in the year when we were trying to predict what the economy would look like. It's really owes a lot of the fact that we're not in recession and close to achieving the soft landing because of a very high rate of consumer spending. So Will that keep up next year? Rob and others think that it's going to be a pretty good year next year. Let's see how these other factors, including the two conflicts that we have going on globally right now, let's see how that affects everything. So before we go, I do want to thank you again for joining in. We will be back in January. We'll have that date for you really soon, but also mark your calendars, because on February 7th, our annual program, Forecasting the Future, will be held at the College of Marin Novato campus. There, Rob will be giving a much deeper outlook into the economy for 2024. And our focus is going to be this year on business attraction. And we're going to dive right into this issue of commercial real estate. We're going to look at transportation here in Marin and how employers can take advantage of that. And we're going to be talking about how Marin County focuses on business attraction, because as we all know, this is a great place to live and do business. So with that, I'll let you get on with your day. Thank you again for attending. We'll have the recording out to you later today, and please tell your friends so we can keep these going. Have a great day.